Hampshire lives by their state motto, live free or die. I mean, they are, state laws, nope. Alcohol tax, nope. Gun laws, nope. So, they are, if you live here, you can kind of do within reason, do what you want.
As long as you vote Dem.
As long as you don't kill anybody, you're good in New Hampshire. So, but anyway, welcome everybody to Tuesday Night Bible Study. We're going to be finishing up through Joshua tonight and next Tuesday. So we only have 2 more sessions. We're almost done, which is both exciting and kind of a little bit sad. It's exciting because we're finishing, but it's sad because we're like, we've spent, I think by the time we finish, we'll have spent 13 weeks in this book, which is pretty good considering it's got 24 chapters in it. We've managed to break some of those down. But before I go on, a few announcements, just some weekly announcements. Again, Tuesday night at 6:30, we have a Bible study here. Once we're done with Joshua, the first few weeks in November, we're going to have David will be giving another teaching. Those of you who remember were here, David taught on Lashon Hara the last time we were here, the evil speech, gossip. And that was really good, so we're looking forward to see what David brings to the podium on the 2nd of November. And on the 9th of November, Garrett will be teaching that Tuesday night, and it may or may not be his last time teaching on a Tuesday because so they'll be doing that, and then Rabbi's going to do a thing on Hanukkah, and then just before we get into that season, and then we will be going through a series on the order of service, the Siddur, liturgy, and Jewish prayer. And I'm hoping we can squeeze that in just 3. That's the goal. And so if we have to go to 4, we will. But anyway, so Tuesday night, 6:30, Bible study. And then we have on Wednesday morning at 7:30, we have men's prayer. Last week, we had, for the first time, we had 10 people. We had a minyan. That included a couple people on the phones, but we had 10 people present for men's prayer, and so we would like to see that kind of stay the same and get larger and grow. So, men, if you can make it to prayer, we encourage you, to come to prayer 7:30 in the morning on Wednesdays. Wednesdays at 5:30 p.m. we have the Torah study at the Drowsy Poet on Brent Lane. So read your Torah portion, have some thoughts on it, come prepared to discuss it. On Thursday at 1 o'clock is the ladies' book study, and it's Thursday at 1. It's the ladies' book study, and of course we have Shabbat service. We have foundations class that begins at 9, and the worship service that begins at 10. And interesting thought. I'll share it after. But anyway. Let's see. What else we have going on Friday? On Friday, if you can make it and you can get on base at 10:30 in the morning, there will be a graveside service at Barrancas for Jerry Kozlowski. So if you can get on Barrancas, 10:30 Friday morning will be a graveside service for Jerry Kozlowski. If you can't, don't worry. There will be a memorial service for Jerry at 2 o'clock on Friday. Here at Bradam, and let's see. That's right. We are asking people to please bring finger food. You can make it, or you can buy it as long as it's kosher. But we're just encouraging people, just finger foods, just things that we can set out and people can intermingle and share as we gather together in memory of Jerry and the life that he led. Is there anything else? Anything going on Sunday? I don't think so. Okay. I don't have a list. That's why I'm asking. Huh? Yes. Eitan Shishkoff is coming, not this next, 30th. On the 30th. That's Shabbat. So Eitan. I keep mispronouncing that. Eitan Shishkoff. I'll have it right by the time he gets here. So he comes from Israel, Haifa, and he's traveling around the U.S. right now. So he's going to be in town, and so Rabbi Eric invited him to come and speak. So he will be here at least for the morning service. We are kind of bouncing back and forth whether or not we'll do something for Havdalah at the end of Shabbat, but he'll definitely be here for that Shabbat service. So with that said, I think that's all the announcements we have for now. Any prayer requests in the room?
I just found out tonight that a neighbor of mine is, they don't expect her to make it long ago. Maybe a week. They called the family in to say their goodbyes. So I'm going to go visit her tomorrow
Okay.
morning.
So pray for
Her name is Joyce.
pray for the family and for an easy passing. Okay. Ina?
Just more prayer for the situation.
Yes.
It's cleared up. God's hand.
Yes. Anyone else? Yes.
Praise that I'm healed.
Yes. Praise Catherine is healed and here with us tonight.
Yeah.
Jennifer?
Praise that it appears as if the test results are that everything's fine with me.
Yes. And praise that Jennifer's test results have come back with a good report. We praise good reports in this place. Yes.
Speaking of tests and whatnot, my grandmother goes frequently for blood work, and she got an excellent report, and the doc said, "You have the blood of a 16-year-old."
Yeah.
Oh my.
Praise for Catherine's grandmother, whose blood work came back from the doctor recently, and her blood is exceedingly healthy.
But she does have a little bit of congestive heart failure, so just
Yes.
pray for that.
But just be praying that she's continues to remain healthy. She has a little bit of congestive heart failure, but that's she's 86. So that's just the age. That's just the heart is aged. That there's nothing really you can do about that. That's just what it means is you've led a good long life. We pray it's a praise.
Hope she makes it to 100.
Yes.
Praise for Corbin and a good new next year.
Yes. Praise for Corbin and a good new academic and athletic next year. Are they done?
No,
With-
it's starting.
Okay, they're just starting. Okay, wow. Okay.
The school's in the spring, but the league is now.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Is that everything?
Happy anniversary to Rabbi.
And a happy anniversary to Rabbi and Pammy. This is their 40th anniversary.
Yay!
So
And they're engaged.
they are engaged.
For 10 years.
They are betrothed 10 years out. And they will come together under the chuppah in 10 years and be married. And then let's see. They're out for dinner tonight. Rabbi is treating Pammy to some wonderful food. They're having a very good and I assume what would be a wallet-laden meal. Not KFC or Chick-fil-A, as Rabbi said, or Waffle House. That's right. I know. Shame. So anyway.
Hungry now.
But anyway, I'm sure they're having a good time. So happy anniversary to Rabbi and Pammy, celebrating 40 years. But Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, Lord, we thank you for this day, for bringing us here together again to study your word. Lord, we thank you for all the praises that we've lifted up today. We thank you for Jennifer's report. We thank you for the health of Catherine's grandmother. Lord, we thank you for the relationships that we share with one another. We thank you for marriages, for Rabbi and Pammy's marriage that has lasted 40 years and is going to last at least another 10, as we learned this past Shabbat. And we pray that it will last much, much, much longer than that. That they will continue to be a blessing and a light, not only to us here at Bradam, but to the surrounding Messianic community and to the community here in Pensacola and in Southwest Florida. Lord, we want to pray for those who are at the stage of life of losing loved ones. We ask you to bring peace into their lives, that they would know you, they would know Yeshua, and that, Lord, those who are passing, you would give them just an easy passing into the world to come, and that there would be little pain, little struggle, and that they would just go in peace. Lord, we want to ask you to be with all those who are healing from sickness, from either COVID or other things. We thank you for those, like my wife, Catherine, for healing her and for bringing her back to us tonight. We want to ask you to be with all the children who are in schools, Lord. Keep them healthy, keep them well, keep them safe from material that may be harmful to them. Lord, bless our teachers, bless our school administrators, those who are trying to do the right thing by not only your word, but by our students, Lord. Lift them up and give them the strength and the courage to continue to stand for what's right, and bless them for doing so. Lord, be with students like Corbin who are beginning their new academic year. Bless their academic year, Lord. Give them just the wisdom and the knowledge to pass with good marks, that they'll finish the year well, and that they'll do well also in their athletic fields, Lord, whether it be lacrosse, baseball, football, basketball. Just give them the strength and the discipline to do well, to bless their teammates and their schools with fun games and good lessons in teamwork. Lord, be with Miss Ina and help her situation just to continue to resolve itself, that your hand would be on that situation, that it would be resolved to the fullest extent that it can, and that there would just be peace in her mind and her life regarding that, and that those of us would continue to surround her and to give her that peace that you so often work through each of us. And we ask you for all these things, and we thank you for your word in the name of Yeshua, our King. Amen. Amen. So again, like I said earlier, I'm excited because we're almost done with Joshua, but I'm also a little bit sad because we're about to finish with Joshua. So Joshua is, again, 24 chapters. We're starting in chapter 15 tonight, and we're in the second half of the book. That really is a lot more. It looks more like a record. It's kind of odd. Like, okay, why are we specifying who's got which land allotment? Because anyone who's spent any time studying different Near Eastern peoples, peoples like the Bedouin, Muslims, people who have lived there their entire lives, these people don't have a lot of written records themselves. You're born into these societies and you just are kind of taught and know which lands belong to which families, which tribes. And that just kind of passes on with you. So it's an interesting question. Okay, why did the Israelites decide to keep all these records of these borders of these tribal allotments? So we're going to kind of get into that tonight as we're going through. So we have 9 chapters left to go. Last week we kind of did a review, which was good for both you and I think. It kind of got me back in the mind track of, okay, we're in Joshua. So, and tonight there will be a lot of reading simply because there is, and I may skip some, simply because a lot of it's not stuff that is going to be stuff that I'm teaching on. A lot of it is kind of like so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. It's more like, and this land went to this land, to this land, to this land. And in years to come, I'll probably run through Joshua again, and I'll probably actually have like a map where I can like point to each of the border land allotments. Because even for me, it's kind of, as I'm learning, it is sometimes difficult, and you really have to piecemeal the different borders from different parts of where they're assigned. Because in one part of Joshua, you'll read about, okay, a tribe inherited this part of the land. And the further you go along, it'll either expand or contract, depending on how the conquest has gone in their land. Yes?
In that vein, do we read that Benjamin, we see often in the Bible, Benjamin and Judah are kind of yoked together, that they come in a pair when they speak or spoken of?
Often,
Is
yeah.
that because they both share Jerusalem?
Not in Joshua.
Didn't you?
But it speaks specifically of someone else who shares Jerusalem with Judah, and we'll get to that tonight. It's not. I don't remember reading about Benjamin that much in this passage, but again, I'm also using a JPS, so it may just be a different name. But I don't recall. If we get to it, we'll get to it, because we are going to read about who inherits Jerusalem, because that actually does have specifically to do with one of my notes tonight, and I can't remember it all right now at once. But so we'll get to that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But anyway, all right, so in chapter 15, we'll begin in verse 1. The portion that fell by lot to the various clans of the tribe of Judah lay farthest south, down to the border of Edom. Now, again, because Judah takes so much in the south, Benjamin probably falls into the south somewhere, and I think Reuben is as well. There's a few mentioned in chapter, I think 18, that fall down in the southern borders. So, down to the border of Edom, which is the wilderness of Zin. And so, anytime it mentions a place that sort of covers a large swath of area, I like to look at the word and kind of find out where it is and what it means. The wilderness of Zin is a desert area which includes a place called Kadesh Barnea. Kadesh Barnea. Kadesh has two alternate names. It can either be En Mishpat, spring of judgment. We see this word used in Genesis 14:7, or the waters of Meribah, the waters of strife. This is in Numbers 20:13, Numbers 24, Numbers 27:14, and Deuteronomy 32:51. So this is a large area. This is not just a small portion of land on the western side of the Jordan. This covers part of the Jordan, part of the wilderness. It's a large desert and a large area that consists of springs. It's noted for how many springs exist kind of throughout it, different wells. So it bears the names of making, it's a sort of a place of judgment and gathering, and it's also a place where a lot of Moses' family members end up passing away and dying within this region or very close to it. And a lot of them die from judgment. So it's not, it's kind of, geography. There are other people who are well more versed in this than I. Sacred geography. There is something to the places in the Bible and why things happen there. When they happen in the right seasons and everything. So we'll go ahead and we'll read from verses 2 to 12. Their southern boundary began from the tip of the Dead Sea, from the tongue that projects southward. It proceeded to the south of the ascent of Echarbim, passed on to Zin, ascended to the south of Kadesh Barnea, passed on to Hezron, ascended to Adar, and made a turn to Karka. From there it passed on to Asmon and proceeded to the Wadi of Egypt, and the boundary ran into the sea. That shall be your southern boundary. The boundary on the east was the Dead Sea, up to the mouth of the Jordan. On the northern side, the boundary began at the tongue of the sea at the mouth of the Jordan. The boundary ascended to Beth Hoglah and passed north of Beth Arabah. And the boundary ascended to the stone of Bohan, son of Reuben. The boundary ascended from the valley of Achor to Debir and turned north to Gilgal, facing the ascent of Adumim, which is south of the Wadi. From there, the boundary continued to the waters of En Shemesh and ran to En Rogel. Then the boundary ascended into the valley of Ben Hinnom, along the southern flank of the Jebusites, that is, Jerusalem. The boundary that ran up to the top of the hill, which flanks the valley of Hinnom on the west, at the northern end of the valley, the Rephaim. From that hilltop, the boundary curved to the fountain of the waters of Nephtoah, and ran onto the towns of Mount Ephron. Then the boundary curved to Baalah, that is, Kiriath Jearim. From Baalah, the boundary turned westward to Mount Seir, passed north of the slope of Mount Jearim, that is, Chesalon, descended to Beth Shemesh, and passed on to Timnah. The boundary then proceeded to the northern flank of Ekron. The boundary curved to Shikaron, passed on to the Mount Baalah, and proceeded to Javneel, and the boundary ran on to the sea. And the western boundary was the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. Those were the boundaries of the various clans of the Judites on all sides. And so, again, that's why, some of this it won't be, it's not pertinent to a lot of the different themes I'm going to hit tonight in the book. Which is why, depending on where we are, I may decide to not read every boundary because it's not all pertinent to the points that I'm going to try to make as we go through the book. So again, like I was saying, it's funny to me that this exists as a record. Because, ancient peoples historically have always had a good knowledge of, this is my family's place. That's your and your family's place. That tribe over there, we're forbidden from going over there. We're not supposed to mess with their livestock or drink from their wells kind of thing. And it resulted in all sorts of feuds and fights, and we see this, carry on up into the 19th century, the 20th century, even today. This is a big part of why, world powers like Britain, like England, like France can't make certain people groups work together. There's just too much animosity. They're trying to draw borders, where it makes part of your family's land on ours, and their tribes, intermingling with both of ours. That doesn't work. So it's funny to me that Joshua has all these records of borders, because usually that's not something you would have seen written, especially because most people didn't write. When you look at societies who don't read and write often, their memories are much better. Because, if I tell you something, like, for example, and I hope no one gets too offended about all this tonight, when we make announcements at Bredon, lots of people just assume, because we write it everywhere on Facebook, on the website, we post it on the slides on Shabbat morning, and we tell everyone all the time that they're going to hear it again or see it again at some point. So with that assumption in mind, they don't necessarily commit it to memory, which is why the office gets lots of phone calls during the week about when is this, when is that, when is this, when is that, when is this, why are we doing that? Because it's not something that people take upon themselves to commit to memory. When you live in a society where reading and writing are not everyday things, you take what someone says to you, what someone teaches to you, and you take it to memory a lot easier. And that's why these societies remember stories so much better, because when your city elder is sitting around in a circle during your fall festival telling a story, the children remember that story, because then they go off and they reenact it and play it around the outskirts of where all the adults are. That's just how it works. They remember it better because they're not reading about it incessantly. And so, again, like we covered before, Joshua also covers a lot of narrative. So it's not just record. But it is interesting that the second half, we get all this, what looks like more legal work. Like if you were to go into a lawyer's office, especially a legal office that deals with commercial property, you're going to read, you're going to pull books off the shelves or files out that say, oh, by the way, so-and-so's lot, aligns from, this far north, this far south. It's this much square footage. It's worth, each square foot is worth this much. With this much inflation, it goes up to yada yada yada, etc. So it looks just very involved with what we'd call legal text. But Joshua is not a legal text. It's not like Leviticus or Numbers, which includes a lot of how you are to do things. Joshua is mostly narrative, and so it is funny to me that we have all this in here. But I think it's in there for a reason. The lists, all these lists of borders, I don't think are in there to specify to the Israelite people, here's where you're to go. I don't think they went back and consulted the book of Joshua like we would in a legal office, like, well, Jerry, you may want that meadow for your crops, but your Reubenite brother over here, this is clearly his land. So you're clearly imposing upon his boundaries. I think the list here exists to amplify Israel's relationship with God. That the listing of these land parcels aren't necessarily recorded for future generation, as the legal text, but they're recorded there to remind Israel that God keeps His word. Because if you think about it, this is another one of those, what we look at as a detailed list, we read it as a detailed list, sort of like when we read about the Mishkan, we read about how the tabernacle's built, and it seems very detailed, seems very complex, like, man, this has got every measurement, but if you've ever actually worked in construction, the details for the tabernacle is very lackluster in detail. God gives a lot of wiggle room for how to make a lot of those things. God says, I want it to look like this, and it should be about yay big. But then when it comes to how to actually construct it, all of that is left up to the people who build it. And I think that's a lot of what we have going on here, is that this is a reminder not so much of the exact measurements of the borders of the tribal allotments, but a reminder that God keeps His promises and that God has given you your space. He told you would inherit this land. Here it is. And, it's not only recorded as having happened, but, you live in it today. It's a reminder that God, as long as Israel walks in obedience, God continues to preserve their inheritance. I think the same thing with a lot of genealogies, because genealogies, they aren't necessarily, they exist to preserve a record. Yes, we see, Yeshua's line is preserved for us to see down the line, but I think the more important thing about genealogies is not so much that we know who begat who, because, quite frankly, there's only really about 5 people in even Yeshua's line that we actually bother to study. Most of us don't really know who a lot of the other people are. And it's not that we don't care, it's just that, there's nothing significant mentioned about them. The genealogy is what matters, not so much the detail. That's to remind us that, God is always present. God was present in each one of the lives of those people, whether they were coming out of Egypt. We go all the way back to the very beginning, whether, which family they came from before Jacob went into Egypt, when they were in Egypt, when they came out of Egypt, when they went into the land, through the exile with Babylon, back into the land, all the way down to Joseph and Mary. So the genealogy is important to remind us that, it reminds us that God is constantly there. And I think, again, I'm not saying the genealogy isn't important, because it matters who Messiah is. His bloodline does matter. But the greater and more important thing, because again, Yeshua is not the only one that has a genealogy, the more important lesson with genealogies being recorded is that God is with this person. God is with all the generations down. And even though part of that generation may have not been walking with God, God was always there, because again, it's in the book, and the book exists to show God walking with man, whether or not man was walking with God in those moments or in those times. So 13 and 14. In accordance with the Lord's command to Joshua, Caleb, son of Jephunneh, was given a portion among the Judites, namely Kiriath Arba, which is Hebron. Arba was the father of Anak. Caleb dislodged from there the 3 Anakites, Sheshai, Aiman, and Talmai, descendants of Anak. And what's funny about that name, Talmai, is it sounds very much like the word Tameh. I think Tameh is the word for unclean. So it sounds similar, but not quite spelled the same. Let's see, that's through 17. From there he marched against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kiriath Sefer, and Caleb announced, "I will give my daughter Achsah in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath Sefer." His kinsman, Othniel the Kenizzite, captured it, and Caleb gave him his daughter Achsah in marriage. So Achsah's name, names are a thing of mine to look at, especially if it's a pivotal character or it's a character that seems out of place. And this is one of those narratives that kind of pops up in the middle of what looks like a record, and it just seems kind of like, why is this here? So her name comes from the root word ekes, which means anklet, bangle, or a tinkling ornament. So something pretty that makes noise. And I think that's a fitting name for a daughter. But the more, on down in 17, I love how once again Caleb's family, not just himself, is mentioned. And it talks about, Caleb's kinsman who is living among Israel, living with the people of Israel. He's conquered the land of Israel with the children of Israel. He's probably assisted Caleb in capturing and defeating the Anakites. He's still called a Kenizzite. He's not made into something else. And they live with Judah. They're part of the Judites. Caleb has been representing the tribe of Judah since before they came into the land. Caleb was one of the ones who went in as one of the first group of spies. So they are still referred to as their initial family name. And so, again, this points out that in Scripture, when Scripture mentions Gentiles living in the not being in the presence of God, that's when Gentile is used negatively. It's a word, goy, goyim. It's used with a negative connotation to describe people who are living pagan lifestyles, who are living, you're not to live like the Canaanites. The Canaanites can live like you. We see this with Rahab. it's not. So it's talking about Gentiles who are living in the presence of God with the people of God, not living as Gentiles would live normally, which is it's scripturally normally associated with wicked behavior. So it's not saying Gentiles can't be a part of the kingdom of God, because there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of scripture that says Gentiles would be present in God's kingdom. God's kingdom really, scripturally just can't exist without the presence of people birthed in the nations. So people birthed in the nations outside of Israel, they live like Israel. Because it's like when we become children of God, when we become part of God's family, and this was a word thing that I kind of caught on to. Notice how in the Brit Chadashah, the New Testament, whenever Gentiles come to faith, they're called children of Abraham, because Abraham is the father of faith. And Abraham's faith was very active. He lived it out. He actually obeyed God. So it doesn't mean just an intellectual assent to an idea. It's actually faith. It's emunah. It's full trusting. It's walking with God. But we don't become children of Jacob. We're never called children of Jacob. We're never called children of Israel, physical descendants, because God's kingdom will include both physical descendants of Jacob and physical descendants of the nations, both children of Abraham. And so that was one of those things where I was like, I'd like to see that disputed. I haven't seen that disputed anywhere, but until that day comes, God be with you. So let's see. 18 through 20 through 63. Now this is going to be a little bit of a longer read, so I'm going to see if I need to read all of this. I don't think I'm going to read all the rest of 15. And if you're looking at the page, you can see why. Again, it's a lot of the the land record, but that's not what necessarily I want to cover. What I kind of want to cover is more the history about the text and what's going on. So I want you to skip. I know we're skipping. We're not skipping over. And again, like I said at the beginning, like one day I would like to come back and do a class solely on the map portion of Joshua, sort of as I learn and figure that out, because it is complex, because we walk. It's not like they just it tells the story and then gives us a map at the end. The map kind of morphs and grows and molds its way across the book of Joshua as they conquer it, and so it never at one point looks one way. It's constantly changing, and even after the book of Joshua, it continues to change, and I'll get into that at the end. So if you'll skip with me to chapter 15, verse 63. Verse 63 says, "But the Judites could not dispossess the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So the Judites dwell with the Jebusites in Jerusalem to this day." Now we know that this day, that's not true at all. And we even know during Yeshua's day, the Jebusites no longer dwelled in Jerusalem. The Jebusites were kicked out of Jerusalem when David conquered it during his reign as king. So we know that this book, the book of Joshua, at some point, historically, was penned before King David's reign. There's a lot of books that a lot of historians, a lot of archaeologists will try to make after King David's reign, but Joshua, just because of the way it's written, is written in a way that the language suggests it's before King David's time, or right up against it, but it's definitely before he dies. Because again, David and the Israelites take Jebus, they take Jerusalem in 966 BCE. So they would have, who knows the story of when King David does that? Catherine. So they sneak in through the water. It's not a sewer. It's a tunnel. It provides. It's a spring. And they sneak through that. Yeah. And actually, it's funny because that you got to walk it, because it wasn't until 10 years ago that they actually discovered it. Yeah, because I remember being in
Is that Hezekiah's tunnel?
I think I was either in late middle school or high school age when it was huge. They found, because I remember reading it as a child, and I was like, man, that would be something to find that, because I always liked tunnels. I had this thing for tunnels as a kid, so then learning one day that they actually found this tunnel that David and his men had gone through was super exciting for me. So anyway, the way the book of Joshua was written seems to imply that it was written before David's reign, because according to this book, the Jebusites are still dwelling there with the Judites in Jerusalem, or Jebus, which will come to be Jerusalem. So, chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. The portion that fell by lot to the Josephites ran from the Jordan at Jericho, from the waters of Jericho, east of the wilderness. From Jericho it ascended through the hill country to Bethel. From Bethel it ran to Luz and passed on to the territory of the Archites at Ataroth, descended westward to the territory of the Japhletites, as far as the border of Lower Beth Horon and Gezer, and ran onto the sea. Thus the Josephites, that is Manasseh and Ephraim, so these are the tribes of Joseph, received their portion. So, remember that Manasseh, only half of Manasseh is here. The other half is on the other half of the Jordan, where they decide to settle with Gad and Reuben. So this is all of Ephraim and half of Manasseh are receiving their portion here on the west side of the Jordan. The territory of the Ephraimites by their clans was as follows. The boundary of their portion ran from Atroth Adar on the east to Upper Beth Horon, and the boundary ran onto the sea. And on the north the boundary proceeded from Michmetath to the east of Tanath Shiloh, and passed beyond it to the east of Genoa. From Genoa it descended to Ataroth and Narath, touched on Jericho, and ran into the Jordan. Westward the boundary proceeded from Tapua to the Wadi Kana, and ran on to the sea. This was the portion of the tribe of the Ephraimites by their clans, together with the towns marked off for the Ephraimites within the territory of the Manassites, all those towns with their villages. However, and this is where I want you to pay attention to this verse and to the one of the sort of breakups in the next chapter, because this kind of sets the stage for what comes after the book of Joshua. However, they failed to dispossess the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer. So the Canaanites remained in the midst of Ephraim, as is still the case, but they had to perform forced labor. So who remembers the Gibeonites a few chapters back? The Gibeonites deceived Israel, made this pact, and they were kind of forced to be the workhorses of serving, the tabernacle. They brought up water and wood, and so think the same idea here. They're probably serving Israel in more of a corporate function, not so much. They're not like becoming Israelite slaves. Yeah.
Do you think that's where they get the modern synagogue goy?
Maybe that's possible. Yes, before the wall of partition was brought down by Yeshua, yes, that was possibly was the idea of the Sabbath goy. But again, and it's what did God command to do? What did the Israelites to do? What did He command them to do? To dispossess them all, to kill all of them, to drive them out of the land. They're not supposed to be here, unless they become a part of Israel, like Rahab and her family, and I'm assuming many others that actually join into the Commonwealth of Israel, and later on, Ruth, all of those people who continue to dwell there in the land. And Ruth is actually a byproduct of them not obeying this. Is that Ruth is allowed to be birthed into the world as a Moabite, someone from a completely different clan and tribe in the land, close to the land of Israel in Canaan, because they did not dispossess all the peoples of the land. Yes, Jennifer.
Right. So the Canaanites are still there. So what about their gods?
Getting to that. So Jennifer was asking, what about their gods? And that's where, this idea of dispossessing them, they failed to remove the Canaanites who were living like Canaanites. This includes the idea of their gods, their practices. This is why we see later on when Israelite men marry Canaanite women, they draw them off into the worship of their gods, into the worship of their idols. Yes, Liz?
Didn't they know about the curse?
Yes. Most people know the consequences when they pick their actions. So, yes, they absolutely chose to marry Canaanite women, much like Esau chose the women that he chose to marry, and they came with all sorts of idolatry and apparently personality problems that Rebecca wasn't too fond of. But Despite, I mean, and but they knew. Yes, they chose. They knew. When I was at Marion, it was my year where I was in charge of a bunch of cadets. I was upperclassman, and we had all the new guys, and I got the guys separate specifically because for whatever reason at military colleges, guys tend to be the problem makers for. Now, if usually women don't usually cause the problems at military schools, problems are usually around them or about them, but they're not the ones causing the problems. So, guys, I told them, I said, look, you've read your handbook. We've gone over the rules and things that exist for you to be here in good standing with the school, with myself. And I'll tell them, I was like, look, I spend a lot of time in class, in ROTC, and in my room. If I don't know about it, then I don't know about it. But if you get caught and you decided to do it, just understand that you know what the consequences are, and you chose to do it. So the Israelites did the same thing. They knew what the consequences were. They were raised in a society that knew what the consequences were, and yet they chose to do it anyway. And this is sort of goes on to point out a greater problem that will continue to exist throughout Israel. It's funny to me when we have entire segments of people in the Messianic movement, Torah movement, Hebrew roots, whatever you want to call it, who a lot of them act. They'll read about ancient Israel and then they'll act as though, well, we've got to get back to like ancient Israel, like we've got to look kind of like that, like minus some of the bad things, and acting almost as if there was this monolithic faith in ancient Israel. It's like, look, you have for like a blip of a second at Sinai this monolithic, like we're following one God as one people kind of thing. But then immediately afterwards, we're sleeping with the prostitutes in Moab. We're worshiping gods, here in Canaan. We're not dispossessing the Canaanites. We're letting our wives draw us off into worship of strange gods and idols. So there was no such thing as a monolithic faith. Even in Judges, you would think the Levites would be at least the ones safe from this. In Judges, you have people hiring Levitical priests to come and to maintain the idols and the altars of the local deities, and the lesser gods there in those regions. So, no, there was never a monolithic faith in Israel. You had a few, or at least it was not practiced by the majority. You had a few who did, and usually these tend to be the people who follow the prophets themselves. Now, after Babylon, it gets a little bit better. It becomes a little more stringent. Israel begins to take on this identity, this true identity that resembles a lot of what we think existed, but because we have a lot more evidence for that image. But before Babylon, one of the reasons for Babylon was because there was no monolithic obedience and faithfulness to God. So, Judges even begins with the idea that every man was doing what was right in his own eyes, and so there was a tangent. So we're going to go on to chapter 17. We'll go into verse 1 through 11. And this is the portion that fell by lot to the tribe of Manasseh, for he was Joseph's firstborn. Since Machir, the firstborn of Manasseh, and the father of Gilead, was a valiant warrior, Gilead and Bashan were assigned to him. And now assignments were made to the remaining Manassites by their clans, the descendants of Abiezer, Helek, Asriel, Shechem, Hefer, and Shemidah. Those were the male descendants of Manasseh, son of Joseph, by their clans. Now Zolephahad, son of Hefer, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, had no sons, but only daughters. The names of his daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They appeared before the priest, Eleazar, Joshua, son of Nun, and the chieftains, saying, "The Lord commanded Moses to grant us a portion among our male kinsmen." So in accordance with the Lord's instruction, they were granted a portion among their father's kinsmen. 10 districts fell to Manasseh, apart from the lands of Gilead and Bashan, which are across the Jordan. Manasseh's 10 daughters inherited a portion in these together with his sons, while the land of Gilead was assigned to the rest of Manasseh's descendants. And this is a great reading because it's an example of halakha, of how halakha is formed and designed. And we remember this back in the Torah. God had been giving the Torah, the laws to Israel, to Moses, and we have a problem arise. God has given laws on how land is to be inherited through the male heirs. But then we have this man who has no male heirs. So the daughters come to the authorities, who they're supposed to, and they ask them, what do we do? Should our father's line die out because, we're not males? And that's when the authorities, when Moses, and then they turn to God, and they're like, what should we do? And then that's, when God gives them what to do. And they divide it up. But that's an example of how halakha is supposed to work. Halakha is normally not just someone making a decision. It's not just some rabbi or sage making a decision about a subject. It's, it's supposed to be prayerfully involved. It usually is it's not a one person. There's usually more than one person saying, well, here's how do we handle, for example, just a crazy one, but brushing teeth on Shabbat. What should brushing teeth on Shabbat look like? Rabbi, tell me, what should brushing teeth on Shabbat look like? And that's when you would have several rabbi teachers or priests, people of authority would disappear for a while. They would it would be a time of prayer. God, what is honorable to you in regards to work? And they would go through all the different. And I'm not saying this is what we're doing. This is just a kind of an out there example, but it's very obvious. So, which is a very Jewish thing, by the way. Guzma, exaggeration. It's what Yeshua does with if your right hand sins, you should cut it off. Remove, which is an extreme example of what you should do, which is you should cut off the thing from you. It's not telling you to go actually cut your right hand off. So, so using and this is a Torah teaching moment, not a Joshua moment. I can do this all night, so don't get me started. It's using extreme and obvious examples of things that are kind of obnoxious to get a point across, but it ingrains it in your mind. Like a week from now, you're going to remember we talked about toothpaste and toothbrushes and brushing teeth on Shabbat and how that looks halakhically. So, and that's when you would have your teachers go back and look at, turning on the faucet, work. Man, I don't know. You got to push, and if you got a rusty faucet, it may take a little extra oomph. And are you causing the people at the water plant to work? Is your running water causing someone else to have to do something? Squeezing the toothpaste on your tube. Okay, what if your toothpaste tube is really low? You've got to really work that stuff up, and try to get it out of the top. And so, but this is how a lot of halakha is come about. It's never just a quick thing. It's something that's they're praying, they're reading the Torah, they're understanding case law. How did so the toothpaste thing. It's okay, got to really squeeze the toothpaste. So they're going to go back and look. Okay, squeezing things, is that and again, it's an exaggeration, but that's how it comes about. And so. Then they would decide, you're supposed to remain clean on Shabbat. So, how old is your toothbrush? And, is that, how unclean is your... So does everyone kind of get the point of how that comes about? So anyway, so they've, they go before God. They ask him, how should we come about this? Of course, they consult the Torah, and they take, what God tells them. They take the principles in the Torah, and they apply it to the daughters here. And they have now a case law for future families that will come about. So the next family that has all daughters, this is a part of the Torah they're going to come to, either in the Torah or here in Joshua, and this is going to be written somewhere that says, oh look, we already had this problem before, we already know how it's resolved. And if something slightly different comes about, if a family comes 100 years from now and they're all adopted, they're not actually bloodline, but because in Judaism, being adopted is you are of that family itself, then they'll be okay, well, yeah, we just immediately apply it to that. So this will provide, and it builds on one another. That's why things like law first mention. The law first mention is not a biblical law. It's more of it's a rabbinical law that applies to the study of Torah. It's also just common sense. So, people who are really anti-rabbis, it's law of first mention actually just helps you to retain your sanity with word definition, because when a word is first used or a phrase is first used in the Bible, at no other time in the Bible can you look at that phrase differently unless the context is different. And even then, it doesn't do away with the original meaning. It always builds upon or adds to it. It can never zero out the term. So anyway, Torah, halacha. Halacha we've covered more than I think we're going to tonight on that. So let's see. We're almost where we are. Let's see. A lot of this is more borders, and I think I wanted to skip ahead to verses 12 through 13. So skip ahead with me in chapter 17 to verses 12 and 13. The Manassites, again, like at the end, sort of close to the end of the last chapter, the Manassites could not dispossess the inhabitants of these towns that are listed above, and the Canaanites stubbornly remained in this region. When the Israelites became stronger, they imposed tribute on the Canaanites, but they did not dispossess them. So they made them pay taxes. This has never worked well for any conquering kingdom, both religious and or secular. For Israel, we will see that this does not work well. Again, the idols remain, the pagan practices remain, but so it's not good. Yes.
The Tree of Life Bible says that they were put to forced labor. Again.
Yeah, tribute could be that as well. Yeah, tribute could involve labor, paying in gold, spices, livestock. It was what it is, sort of, debtor is slave to the lender. It was whoever you owed wanted for you to do. So it could be translated forced labor, much like we see with the Gibeonites, with the wood and the water, or it could be like we see in a lot of future societies, taxes. For example, Rome imposes lots of taxes on Judah and Judea, the whole region of Judea. They've conquered it, and they're going to make them pay. That does not work out well for Rome a lot of times. Because Judah continues to maintain its religion, it continues to maintain its faith, and then it also continues to kill Roman soldiers. And here in this application, it wouldn't necessarily. I'm sure there were Canaanites who killed Israelites, but it's in more of a spiritual sense. They would drag off Israelites to be killed by engaging in idolatry and pagan practices. So they would kill them by assimilation, not by actually stabbing them. And so. Let's see, verses 14 through 16. The Josephites complained to Joshua, saying, "Why have you assigned as our portion a single allotment and a single district, seeing that we are a numerous people whom the Lord has blessed so greatly? If you are a numerous people," Joshua answered them, "go up to the forest country and clear an area for yourselves, there in the territory of the Perizzites and the Rephaim, seeing that you are cramped in the hill country of Ephraim. The hill country is not enough for us," the Josephites replied, "and all the Canaanites who live in the valley area have iron chariots, both those in Beth Shean and its dependencies, and those in the valley of Jezreel." So they're afraid of the weapons of the Canaanites. Those in Ephraim, those in Manasseh. They're not sort of remembering, which is sort of a funny position to be in, because remember at the very beginning of this book, that it was like everyone feared God. Everyone was walking with Joshua, with God, to the point of, they were charging in and winning all these battles, and they had no fear of anything else. Yes, Liz?
Did they just lose their faith?
I don't know. And I think, I'm touching on that here, is that, over time, possibly, sort of, you have that zeal in the beginning, and it...
Israel, they never lost a battle.
Yes.
They never even thought about retreating.
Yep.
And when they split up into the different, then they couldn't beat
Yep.
people.
Yeah, and so they're starting to have this, this fear of man and what man has rather than what God has told you to do, and which is largely the reason probably why they, were no longer clearing out all the Canaanites all at once. They, were perfectly happy to let them sit there and exist, even though, God told them specifically, clear them out. And so, when there is no fear of God, you tend not to obey God, and then there tends to be a severe lack of wisdom. Part of wisdom is understanding that, if you let the moldy rags sit in the corner, for a month, it begins to harm your own physical health, your nostrils, your lungs, the lungs of your children, and it begins to actually infect and make sick. It's not something that can exist. It has to be cleaned out, put away. And so, you begin to see this. It's like we read about this, sort of this beginning of breakdown in the zeal of the Israelites. Not in their fear of God, which is replaced by this fear of man and this fear of these, the iron chariots. Which can sound scary, but but I don't know. Eastern peoples have for years. I mean, you look at back in the I think it's the 80s. The Mujahideen, who the U.S. largely supported, which would become actually the Taliban. They took on Russian tanks and helicopters with they had no fear of iron chariots. So that kind of fear can be quelled and put away when you are chasing it away for the right reasons. And if you have the proper fear of God, that fear can be completely put away from you. You can charge into battle and have no respect for your life, and you are absolutely like, God has told me to do this, and I'm going to do it. It's like there's a meme that I have. It's of a little apple tree that's sprouted just barely, little thing, and it's got an apple growing on it, and it's like all bent over because it's and someone said my parents planted this apple tree and it began growing in the cracks of their driveway out in like their country home, and this poor thing was just bent over with this apple growing on it. But it's like this thing was meant to grow an apple, and by God it was going to get the job done, and it was. So let's see, verses 17 through 18. But Joshua declared to the house of Joseph, to Ephraim and Manasseh, "You are indeed a numerous people, possessed of great strength. You shall not have one allotment only. The hill country shall be yours as well. True, it is forest land, but you will clear it and possess it to its farthest limits. And you shall also dispossess the Canaanites, even though they have iron chariots, and even though they are strong." So again, this is another example of like the map is expanding, the map is changing again. Joshua's like, you're not only going to have it what you're here, but you're also going to have that as well. Which is why I think it would be really cool is to have one of those maps where you have the different, like in a computer program, you can put the different layers of color. Like you can, if you're really good, you can make like really nice shapes. But for me, it would be more like scribbles. But you can have layers. So throughout the presentation, you can click and it would the different colors will change and blink as you go. And that this would be one that it blinks purple and then it blinks away and then adds another section of purple and it comes up as something else. So it's different now. It's expanding. Yes, Marilyn.
Was Lebanon supposed to be part of Israel then?
I would have to look. I don't know off the top of my head. Now, ultimately, all of that is supposed to be part of Israel. All the way down to the end of Saudi Arabia, all the way through the Sinai Peninsula, on into the northern, sort of like more towards the Kurdish region. All of that is supposed to be the land of Israel, the land that Abraham was promised by God. So yeah, all of that. So ultimately, yes. Whether or not right here specifically in this moment, I don't know off the top of my head, but I will have to look. So.
How many years is between the time when Joshua took over and he was told to fear not, and he told the people to fear not, to this point? How long time?
I would have to look and try to remember. Matter of fact, is there a pen anywhere? Oh. Thank you. I will actually, Yeah, so the question was how many years actually, so basically from like the end of Deuteronomy to now. Yeah, I will find that out for next, for our last session together with Joshua. No, just one more next week. Yep. Yep.
It's possible, I don't know how long it is, but some of the people that are alive at this time that are grown men, they might have been children at that time.
Yeah.
And they don't remember all of the things that were accomplished by the people through the mighty power.
You're absolutely right. And because remember, like Joshua, again, it's, if it was meant to be a record, which I don't think it is meant to be like a record, I think it's meant to be more about, God's dedication to Israel, and, when Israel walks in obedience, God is faithful and God blesses and gives what he's supposed to. Because if Joshua is a record, it is a bad record. Because halfway through the book, it stops. Remember, when we got to, I think, 12 or 13, it says, and there, it ends. The narrative of Joshua is like, and the rest of the land was conquered, and the land saw peace. And that was it. The Joshua ended there. And so it took like all this time and like scrunched it. And then we have this second part that goes into greater detail of actually conquering the land. So Joshua really could be 2 books. But yeah, if it was meant to be a record, like at least for me, someone in a Western society, this is not how I would record all the happening. So that's why I think this book is much more. There's more symbology here. There's more, almost more like prophetic insight of what's to come and how life should look. Revelation, it looks a lot like Revelation. Revelation is a lot of kind of the same stuff, a lot of the same imagery and language that we see here. It doesn't have to be necessarily this. You don't have to have this like perfect chronological understanding, because if you read the book of Joshua like you're reading a chronological book, you're going to be, and like even like myself going through this, I'm like, dude, why are we pausing here and going on to this next part? So anyway, let's see, in chapter 18, let's see, 1 through 7. No. 17. We're going through the last. Yeah, I think actually, no, I'm not done yet. Sorry, I got lost in my thoughts and my notes here. I'm sometimes in 2 different places at once while in the same area. But it seems like all of Joshua's language here seems like he's just getting tired. He's kind of fed up with, he's like, look, like you can take this land. You're not going to be afraid of these chariots. You're going to go take this property, and it's going to be yours. And you're going to clear it, and you're going to dispossess it, which means, he's like, he expects them to clear out, not just, take it, but to, the Canaanites have to go. They have to be removed, them and their practices. And, at the very end, he says, you shall dispossess the Canaanites, even though they have iron chariots, and even though they are strong. So he's acknowledging the threat, and that's something that I think believers can do a lot better with real life issues, is actually acknowledging that they're threatening things. A lot of times people get kind of this weird pie in the sky faith that's like, oh, it's not powerful at all, that's not going to affect you at all, you just have faith, you can carry through it. It's like there are some things, standing up to things sometimes is hard and scary. I mean, there's a lot of times when it's like, I don't know if I have enough faith to stand up against that. I mean, this is a fearsome thing that I'm coming up against. Part of me wishes it was, like back in high school, where sort of the worst things was getting, your phone or your gaming system taken away. That's, it's like that'll shape you up. And, and sometimes those moments seem as a child, as a teen, those are daunting moments. It's like, the thing that connects me to my friends and, is being removed from me. And that, again, that's just a very young person example, but things like buying a house, things like getting in a major car accident with lots of injuries. How am I going to pay for all this? How am I going to endure this? How am I going to heal from all this? Is the other person okay? And dealing with their lawyers and families, things that seem daunting and strong. It's okay to acknowledge when things in life that come against you are daunting moments. It's okay to acknowledge that they may be much stronger than you are. But what you have to do is you have to do what the second set of spies did. You have to do what Joshua and Caleb did, is you have to acknowledge it's strong, but you're like, we can still do this. With God, we can still do this. And so, if you run with that, you'll be okay. So let's see. Chapter 18, verses 1 through 7, and then we'll begin wrapping up there. The whole community of the Israelite people assembled at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The land was now under their control, but there remained 7 tribes of the Israelites which had not yet received their portions. So Joshua said to the Israelites, "How long will you be slack about going and taking possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has assigned to you? Appoint 3 men of each tribe. I will send them out to go through the country and write down a description of it for purposes of apportionment. Then come back to me. So we have probably one of the first historical examples of people doing a survey crew. They shall divide into 7 parts. Judah shall remain by its territory in the south, and the house of Joseph shall remain by its territory in the north. When you have written down the description of the land in 7 parts, bring it here to me. Then I will cast lots for you here before the Lord, our God. For the Levites have no share among you, since the priesthood of the Lord is their portion. And Gad and Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh have received their portions, which were assigned to them by Moses, the servant of the Lord, on the eastern side of the Jordan. So, again, Joshua's getting a little fed up with the Israelites not taking the initiative to go on into the land and do what they're supposed to do, and to establish their inheritance. It's sort of like, when someone has like a bedroom, like it's your kid has a room, and you're like, and I only know this because I was the kid being told this, and it's your responsibility to keep it clean, to govern it. The Legos have to be on the shelf. The gaming system has to be up under the TV, tucked away neatly, governed, controlled. And then you're like, why are you not? Why are the Legos scattered everywhere? Why is the gaming system sprawled all over the place? You need to clean up your mess. So Judah's kind of in that place. He's kind of taking that initial responsibility of like, fine, if you don't want to do it, here, you guys go out, survey the land, write a description, bring it back to me so we can tell them where to go, and then you can go there and actually stay there and possess it like you're supposed to. So much of the Bible is God and leaders speaking to the people like their children, which, they are. And, we are so much of the time very much like children, for better and for worse, depending on what we're going through and how we're choosing to respond to the authority. Are we responding to God? Something my parents always taught me was, when I was hard-headed and not wanting to listen, was, the reason for being obedient to us is so one day you'll know and learn how to be obedient to God. Because that acknowledgement of authority and respect for authority does transfer, and you see it in people's lives. If people will say, oh, I love God, but then you look for how they treat people in, authority positions, whether or not they agree on everything is besides the point. How they respect and treat those in positions of authority, and I'm talking about people like cops, government leaders. That's a telltale sign of how you view those who are set above you. Do you speak respectfully to the cop after you've just been pulled over, for speeding, when you weren't supposed to? Have you, how do you talk about your senator, when you're at conferences and when you're on Facebook? How do you respond to your and it's a challenging thought, because sometimes authority, especially in countries like our own, where it's largely a democratic process, where they may have authority, but because it's a democratic process, it has to be, you also have a hand in governing that authority. So it's a question that every one of us, myself included, have to sit back and ask. An authority structure, for example, big one right now is school boards in the country. How do you address school boards? How do I address clear wrongdoing? So in some cases, and sometimes it's just evil. How do I go in and address this and discuss this in a way that is still honoring to God for the position of authority that these people hold, that a lot of us elected and chose them to hold? And so I'm not going to answer that for you. I want you to answer that for yourself. But it is a good question. I love verse 7 here at the end. It talks about the Levites will not take a portion because their portion is God. Remember, their portion, their inheritance is God. It's the sacrifices. It's the service in the tabernacle. And I love that this has come so much later in Joshua, and sort of like we were talking about earlier, the like, when is this in the timeline? If this is later in the timeline of Joshua, this is not even in the beginning of when they entered the land, but much closer towards kind of settling down, that it establishes outside the Torah the Levites' inheritance being the service in the tabernacle, the service in the temple. And it kind of displaces that idea about the Levites not being necessary in the Messianic era and the kingdom to come, when there will be a functioning temple. Because what you do is you end up robbing Levi of his inheritance. Remember, God promises him, I promise that this is a forever covenant. This is not something that's going to end, with the changing of eras. This is something that's forever. Forever means forever. Really what it is just a weird form of replacement theology. It's a strange idea that somehow now that we don't actually need the temple priesthood to function as the temple priesthood, which they will. And because we see them, in Isaiah, we see God restoring the Israelites. It takes them, the nations sort of regather around, and the sons of Jacob, the Israelites, begin coming out of the nations again, gathering back to this place, and then God takes from them Levites and priests, and restores them to their position of function in corporate Israel. And we see kind of the beginnings of this, I think, or at least what it kind of will look like in years to come before that, is in a lot of, especially Orthodox synagogues, you don't necessarily have Levites, people who are descended from Levi, who are operating as rabbis or the teachers. A lot of the times they're just there, and they do the priestly blessing. That's their honor, that's their position, in the synagogues, to do that blessing, because it was commanded to them by God to do that. And so that's part of them and their inheritance being lived out today in the world. I think I had something else about that, but I can't remember at the moment. And so next week we will wrap up Joshua. It will not. It probably will take us about as long, maybe longer, because it's the last bit. But we're going to get through it. We're going to be like that apple tree. Like, by God, we're going to do it. So we will finish Joshua next week, and I hope we'll finish it in time, because there's a little video that I'd like to play at the end. Just a little summary of. I don't know if it'll work on here, will it? Probably, okay. But it's a whole little summary of the book of Joshua, so you'll get to. We'll finish up sort of like the minor minutia and details that Jonathan thinks are interesting, and then we'll watch that at the end. And yeah.
Can we also watch Josh and the Big Wall?
I don't know if we can do that all next Tuesday, but
How about just
yeah.
the song?
We can maybe watch the song. We should have done that at the beginning, though. That's what I'll do the next time I do Joshua. We'll do the at the beginning. One of the VeggieTales silly songs, Josh and the Big Wall episodes, we think is fun to play every now and then. So I think that's it for tonight. So thank you, those of you that watched online, and those of you who came in person. We're so glad to see you all here. And remember, those of you online, when you need to come in person, first of all, because when we do the, and I know a lot of you can't, but those of you who can, please come, because when we do the teaching on the order of service and prayer, we will be having an instructional period on wrapping talit, what it looks like to wear the talis, the talit on Shabbat, and wrapping, laying tefillin, how to do that. So it will be more of an instructional teaching. Yes. And people can bring dinner, yes. And Catherine's reminding me, and I know she posted it in one of the Facebook pages today, that you can bring dinner. We're not serving dinner here, but you are more than welcome to bring. Catherine and I bring our dinner often. You can bring a sack lunch. You can bring a Tupperware of whatever have you. We have a microwave. It's perfectly fine for you to bring your dinner and even eat during the lesson. I'm not going to complain. I went to college. I understand the whole eating in class thing. This is not high school anymore. So please come. We'd love to have you here, listening, growing, learning, and able to walk alongside one another in the flesh.